Hey guys, welcome to this third installment of the video training series all about grow. Joining me today, we have Austin Allred, who is the owner of Royal Family Farming and also the co-founder of Grow. Austin, welcome to today's show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here with y'all.
Austin, why don't you give us just a really quick overview, maybe take a couple minutes. Tell us about your background and what you do.
Well, I'm a farmer, not a typical or even close to typical technologist, or even that I know what that means. But I farm. I grow food, primarily proteins, but vegetables and fruit also. I grew up on a vegetable and fruit farm. So my dad, for the last couple generations, has been in a family where they grow potatoes, apples, cherries, and sweet corn, peas, fruits and vegetables. And then I went off to college, went to college in Utah, did business management, economics, and some of those pieces. Really didn't want to study farming just because I felt like I'd had enough in some ways. Not that I didn't want to come back and farm, but I didn't want to learn about it in school. So I worked at a lot of farms in Utah, Idaho, Texas, and traveled around for that era, that 5 or 6 years. And then I moved back home. And when I moved back home, I started more of a protein operation, which is it's a nice way of saying a cattle farm. So these days I have dairy and beef, and then I'm working really closely with my family's homesteaded farm, the fruits and the vegetables, and I'll link that all together as we talk more about regenerative ag at scale and how we're able to do that because of that diverse operation. But between the family and myself, we grow all sorts of different types of crops, and we're trying to just close that loop and be more sustainable and more regenerative and make sure that we can we can do this for generations. We can do this for a long, long time. Farming is not, there's never a short-term plan. We don't sit around and say, what's our EBITDA? How can we exit? Those words don't come up in our boardroom. It's all about next generation. These kids are moving back, yada, yada, yada. And so that's really the genesis of regenerative agriculture for us, is we want to be able to sustainably have this diverse operation so we can continue to grow food for the world for generations to come.
Okay, here's a curveball question, maybe. I watched a documentary recently. It was about sustainability. It was about how we can, reduce our carbon footprint. And the number one thing that stuck with me from that documentary is that they said the biggest producer of carbon emissions are cattle ranches. Agree, disagree?
Disagree,
Tell me
100%.
why.
So I don't want to pretend like all cattle ranches are created equal. Just like everything, I'll speak in generalization, but there's always the bad players, right? In every aspect, and we can focus on those and draw a very dirty picture, and and we should at times we should self-regulate that. But what happens in that conversation? Because it's a popular conversation. There's two sides of the formula, and we'll dive deeper into this with some of the other questions coming up. I'd imagine. There's cattle. Cattle emit. When cattle are turning grass and some of these vegetables that, by the way, we cannot consume, we cannot digest. Our one part stomach can't do nothing to it. A ruminant, a four-part stomach within a cow, can turn that into protein. In that process, there is emissions. There is quite a bit of emissions. There's emissions in enteric, so cows don't fart, but they do burp. There's emissions in just feeding those cattle with the diesel, and there's emissions in manure if you don't manage it correctly. There is emissions. You can manage all those pretty well, and we're proving that with selling carbon credits and a lot of stuff we're doing. The other side of the formula that nobody wants to bring up, if they're radical on trying to prove that cattle are bad, or in many instances that they're selling some product that happens to be plant-based protein patties, is they leave out the other side of the conversation, and that's the very symbiotic role that cattle have with soil. And if you want to talk carbon sequestration, it all boils down to soil. And if you want to talk healthy soil, you cannot get down that conversation 2 paragraphs without talking about ruminants, cattle, and their role in soil health. And healthy soil means more carbon sequestration, even carbon banking, and that's where the radical piece that wants us to talk about the cattle and the cattle emissions, they don't consider two sides of the formula. Because I do. I have very much, all my cattle, my beef animals are carbon negative because I track what's sequestered with their role in the soil and the grasses that's growing to feed them and what they emit. And I have that number. And on average, when I butcher my cattle, that formula has given about a negative zero point 0.2 tons of carbon sequestered into the soil versus emitted from that animal.
Fascinating. So I can tell, as I've spoken to you previously and just in what you just said, that you're pretty passionate about this. So for the average person, when we think about farmers, when we think about agriculture, environmental consciousness isn't necessarily the top of the list that we think about. Where did this come from, this passion that you have for being a responsible steward of the land?
I think it came from this two parts. One, I grew up with it. My family, it's not far, again, speaking generally, farmers are the original environmentalist. Farmers don't just want a clean planet and good soil and healthy environment. We need it. We need it for our cash flow. We are in the business of creating life. Carbon is life. Carbon is the pulse of all life. So it is imperative that we are considering that. And I very much was. Growing up, my dad very much, we were in the dirt. We were looking at the dirt. We were checking the soil and making sure it was healthy and feeding it. Yada, yada, yada. Started there. I went to school. When I went to school, I came from a big farm, right? It kind of never crossed my mind in the little podunk royal city that people thought farmers were bad in some instances. We're killing the planet. I went to school and I got bombarded with some of these questions, and I was like, what the hell are people talking about? What is this? So I dove deep into it, and I learned two things. One is farmers are closed off. We have not told the story. We do not trust, and again, speaking in generalization, we do not share our data. We don't want to, and I don't mean me, because I'm obviously on the other side of this spectrum, but my father and that generation, they're not sharing any information. And they're doing that, again, it's complicated, but they're doing that because it's a lack of trust. The government has completely just bombarded them. It's come from the top down, right? The government and Costco have come in and said, this is how you need to farm, and it just pisses them off to no end. And the other side of that is people for the last generations, there really was a generational swap here. Everybody had been to a farm. Everybody grew up on their grandpa's farm in the summer times. And then we kind of had that generation that nobody had been to a farm. And so that whole, complicated scenario has blown up in the last 20 years. And so we've got an ignorant public, again, speaking generally, in a very private farming group, which brings us to where we are.
Why is it so important that we as a civilization learn not just to have, regenerative processes, regenerative systems, but to have it at scale? Why is that a key part of this conversation?
I try my very hardest not to be radical. I think there's only a few things that we can afford being radical in, and we can talk about that, Jesus being one of them. But other than that, we don't need to be radical. And I think we have too much of this radical going on every side of the spectrum. So what I'm getting to is regenerative agriculture is amazing. Regenerative agriculture is my passion. But if you watch all the social media trends, regenerative agriculture is also very small scale. And it's not considering anything outside of the neighborhood, which can become a problem really quick. It's not realistic that the city of Seattle is going to send their citizens out to all have 1 acre parcels. That's not a winning equation. So I think we miss the mark in some places. Not to say there's anything wrong with it. It is fantastic, and we should continue to endorse it. It's a research and development project. Regenerative agriculture, as we know it in these small forms, is where I've learned everything I've learned. It's amazing. On the other side, we have commercial agriculture, and it can get too bottom line driven, and it very much has. And you can blame the farmer for that, but it's a whole complex supply chain, incredible as it is, that has missed the mark. And so regenerative agriculture at scale is learning how to do these pieces that we learn from these incredible regenerative farms, understanding what the supply chain is that feeds this world and marrying them together. Because we got to continue to feed the citizens of this world. And frankly speaking, where my passion resides is probably in feeding the most vulnerable of those citizens, because they're the people who will be left in the dust if we don't fix some of these challenges. And if we go all the way to this regenerative concept or this organic concept, we will leave a certain segment of people who need the food the most, maybe, in the dust. So I don't know if that makes sense, Joe, but that's kind of the complexity to it that I think we have to really watch out for and learn and understand and do this for real at scale.
Okay, so on that subject, one of your big projects that you started, I'm not sure how many years ago, you can tell me, was Farm Tracer. What was Farm Tracer? Why was it created? What did it do? And then we'll talk about what it does now. But what was the genesis of Farm Tracer for you?
So let me start with kind of a zinger, and we can talk about it later, or you can keep me going that direction. But our labeling system across the world, even in America, which the labeling system in America is way more regulated than any other labeling system, but our food labeling system is broken. So if we understand that, and again, we can dive into that rabbit hole, but just go with that assumption. The labeling system in America is, for the most part, broken.
Meaning the labels that are on our food when we go to the grocery stores, we're reading the ingredients, we're looking at the certifications. That's what you're talking about, correct?
Correct. Yep. When you go to the grocery store, the average consumer has no clue what that actually means. There is a lot of regulation to it, but the average consumer is ignorant to what that actually means and what they think it means. The warm and fuzzies they pay more for, and the reality of what that means. It's blown up, and I don't see a great fix for it.
What kinds of labels? Are we talking like cage-free eggs, grass-fed beef, organic?
Yep. American raised, all those pieces. There is so much complexity to that it doesn't hardly ever mean what you think it means. And it's really nobody's fault in some ways. It's just broken. So I'll try to be brief. We'll touch every single one of those. Cage-free eggs. That means that these commercial farmers, because again, remember, if you're buying something at Costco, for example, that is at scale. I work with Costco, and I don't work with Costco because in some cases, I'm not even big enough, and I'm one of the biggest family farms that most of you have ever met. But Costco works in DCs, distribution centers, and usually 3 or 4 at a time. And if you can't feed 3 or 4 DCs, you're not even eligible. So when Costco has cage-free, what that means is, and we're all doing our best, but you have to at some point make a box. You have to make a checklist, and by default, that's going to go from let's try to figure this out the best we can to let's work within this box so we can check the box and get that label. So cage-free, in reality, it's the same barns, just half as many chickens in those barns, and then a couple hours a day, the doors are open, they have a little bit of space. It's not what you think it is. It's still a mess. In fact, it's a bigger mess because with that social atmosphere of cage-free, there's actually more fighting, more pecking because there's more space. So anyway, I don't need to get into that, but it's not this beautiful green grass. It's still a very much commercial production that if you talk to the farmers who do it, they say it's worse. Grass-fed, there's only a few regions in this whole world that can truly grow a consistent grass-fed pattern. Meaning you're like Hawaii, your coastal climates. They have a warm enough weather that they might have grass year-round. Almost every other region has grass for a few months here, and then maybe again for a few months here. Then you go to snow, then you go to too hot to have grass. So Grass-fed does not mean that your cattle are out on the range their whole life. It never means that in a commercial operation. It might mean that if you're buying it from your neighbor next door. Those animals are going to be 2 to 3 times the age. If those animals are in grass their whole life, they're going to be 2 to 3 times the age of a more commercial beef production, system. So it's not what you think it is. Organic, again, it just goes back to this box. When you grow organic food, you expect 20% less on your yield. And so to do that, you have to get paid, at least 20 to 30% more for your product. And what that means is we aren't growing enough food for organic. We can't feed the world with this organic standards. And the standards are all based on kind of top down. They're all based on what the government and what the retailer, the massive retailer, wants to be based on. So it's just another way to control supply and demand. And it's not just kind of this pure motive hunky-dory that a lot of times we think it is.
Okay, so enter FarmTracer. What is FarmTracer?
FarmTracer is 1.0. My version of FarmTracer that I started was simply complete transparency on your food. The farmers in our family farm, we very much are tracing all of the practice we're doing. It's all a part of it. When our animals are born, within the first hour of life, they're going to get an electronic ear chip in their ear. That's going to have 5 or 6 generations on that ear chip, and then those animals are going to have every life event tracked on that ear chip so that we can manage better. We've been doing that for 10 years to be able to manage those animals more specifically and be able to make sure we're doing a good job for them and for the bottom line. So we are tracking so much data on our animals, and that's true for every single product we grow. Our apples, we track how much we water them, when we turn the water on, how much water is coming out of each sprinkler, what we use for fertilizer, when we put the compost on, what our yields were. Anyway, we're tracking all this information. We have so much data at our fingertips. FarmTracer was a version to compile this data, put it in a form that was attractive to the end consumer, and then giving them a chance to scan a barcode when they're eating their steak and understanding what that animal ate, what its carbon footprint was, what the practices were that went into growing that animal, and just a very raw data, completely transparent, concept versus this is grass-fed, this is organic, and take your word for it. Well, this is some of those things, but this is how, and kind of diving into it. So going from the 30-second version to the 3-minute version of where does my food come from.
Okay, so that was the first iteration, and then FarmTracer has now evolved into Grow. Talk about how the blockchain has made that product that you just described exponentially better.
Yeah, so FarmTracer would have been probably just fine for my farm. But understand that my farm's pretty unique. A family farm like we have at Royal Family Farming that is really, really diverse, that is pretty vertically integrated at a real scale, is really, really unique. So FarmTracer would have been okay if I was willing to share my data to another company that I owned in order to share that with the end consumer. See what I mean there?
Uh-huh.
Because I have a trust with FarmTracer, which is a company I own. That's okay. That data isn't ever leaving my hands. So I probably could have made it work. It would have been difficult because I'm not a technologist, but I probably could have made it work for my products. What blockchain does is it allows us to blow this up to the masses, because typically you don't have this large family farm that all work together with 7 or 8 real products, real food products, and an app that you trust to share your data with. The normal farmer doesn't share their data, period. Especially with the government, with anybody for that matter. They don't share their data. So what Grow has done is it's allowed this process to go decentralized. So now, as you guys probably understand even better than me, now that we have a decentralized blockchain to put this data onto, it allows us to scale this way beyond royal family farming, which is really, really important.
Yes. So how does Grow now on the blockchain help with a lot of the problems that we talked about earlier? The sustainability, regenerative farming, the food poverty, food inequality. How does Grow help with those areas?
We are able to have a transparent food system, which is what the consumer wants, right? And rightfully so. We go back to that, the very beginning of my conversation. The consumer is very much disconnected from the farm, but still, we care what we eat. I mean, it's a part of us. I mean, of course, we want to be involved with what we eat, but our system doesn't really support that today, and I don't see an easy track to go back to that in the sense of like, okay, all you urbanites, you need to go farm your own food. Good luck. Not going to
Right.
work in every region, every climate. That's not a realistic possibility. So the transparency is critical, and the transparency in a real, honest, blockchain like form that isn't owned by even the government or any other regulatory wing. It's owned by a blockchain, which is decentralized. It allows us to have a complete transparency in order to give that to the end consumer. It bridges that gap. Does that make sense? Am I
Yeah.
speaking to what you understand?
Yeah. So the consumer demand will basically create better practices because they know what they're asking for, they know what they're getting, as opposed to today we're blindly purchasing. Is that a
Yes, that's a good summary. And let me just, I mean, you might look at the organic labeling system. That's what I'm going to keep referencing because it's probably the most recent success story of labels. We came out with these regulations and we grow organic, but we do it for money. That's it. Um, and you come out with these systems of what check the box for organic, and so farmers implement those practices, and they they reduce their yields as a result, and then they go sell that for more money in the grocery store. That's kind of the typical model. If we just continue to duplicate that model for, okay, now we understand regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture is more than organic. It's different. It's better. It's improved. If we just try to stick to that same model, I see that as being unsuccessful. I see that as sending us the wrong direction. The model with blockchain and transparency, it allows for what we need from the consumer, but it also allows for the farmer to do what's right and to have complete, like you said, Joe, I mean, this consumer driven trend to do what's right, to be sustainable, to have that carbon footprint, to show how that all works together in a way that we can trust and isn't polluted by a centralized system that can adjust that and change that in order to, demand more money at the end or tweak and change this and that.
great? So
I
let's
hope I'm
switch
making
gears.
sense. Please tell me if
Yeah,
I'm
no,
not, because
no, you
I'm not a
absolutely
public
are.
speaker. This is not my
No, this
jam.
this is great information. So let's switch gears and talk about Growbox. What is Growbox?
So Growbox is a system of farming that we can use within our tool belt of feeding cattle that allows us to harvest good, concentrate, nutrition-rich food every 2 or 3 days versus once a year.
How is
So
that done?
so you plant seeds that become sprouts. The life cycle of a plant, they're going to go through stages of protein packed, more energy, carbohydrate, and then back to they're going to release their seeds, and that's when it becomes a grain. So if you want protein, which we do need a lot of protein, that's how you grow animals efficiently. We want to harvest our plants in the earliest stages. Now, when you're only harvesting your alfalfa field once a year, or I guess we cut it 5 times a year, but your triticale field and your grass once a year, then you can't just go out there and harvest it when it's young, even though we all know that's the best feed value. You have to wait to get a little yield there. So what a grow box is it's constantly on a daily basis spitting out the sprouts. So the protein packed plants that you can feed your cattle to on a daily basis versus just going out once a year, harvesting those sprouts that you could in your field, bring them back, and then you have a limited supply today and maybe for the next few weeks. Grow box allows you to consistently have that.
So these are boxes that you would store inside and artificially light. Is that right? How does that work?
Yep, yep. It's a tool in our toolbox. Like we have those plants growing so that we can feed our animals a robust diet. So those grow boxes are going to be growing sprouts daily in artificial light. They're going to be growing in mostly water, but we will have some nutrients that are within that water to make sure that those plants are thriving and healthy. But those sprouts are going to pop up every 2 or 3 days, and we're just going to kind of have a revolving door of planting every day, harvesting every day, and feeding what we harvest on a daily basis as a portion of that diet for the cows.
Okay, and what does all of that have to do with blockchain?
Well, I mean, it's kind of going back to where you started, Joe, is how does blockchain solve some of these problems? We know that as farmers, we need to be more regenerative. We need to understand how we can grow our food sustainably. We need to understand how we can grow our food without a whole bunch of synthetic inputs that are mined or collected from somewhere else, not on our farm. God created a perfect system, and that's what regenerative ag is understanding that system and working within those natural cycles. So the grow box is allowing us to be better farmers. It's allowing us to grow better food on our farm sustainably in a closed loop. And then the blockchain is giving us that incentive from the customer down to do that in a transparent way that the consumer can understand, the consumer can have trust with, and incentivizing the farmer to actually do it in the best way, not just this way that all of a sudden you check a box so that you can hit a label.
So everything that's grown inside these grow boxes is tracked and verified on the blockchain and ultimately gets back to the consumer using Grow.
Exactly. So really everything that's done in the grow box, everything that's done in the field, everything that's done with the cattle is all tracked on the blockchain. All of those management practices, which is not foreign to farmers, they are tracking that. They are recording that and watching that and managing that. But now with the ability to put that on the blockchain, that allows that to go into that decentralized system and really be shared with the end consumer and build the value in that to the end consumer.
Got it. How is Grow incentivizing farmers to use better sustainable practices?
So again, we kind of go back, and I'm not disparaging the organic system, but it shows a pattern of what our labeling system has done. You implement these practices, you check a box, you get more for your food in the grocery store. Very few people who can afford that are able to buy that, and it's great. That's the system. But what Grow is doing is it is building in more value. So the digital rewards are giving the farmer additional incentives to do what's right outside of the current process and mold and box that we know of through these labels.
Perfect. So our Connect affiliates are watching this and they're wondering, okay, so I love what I'm hearing, but help me connect the dots. So if I buy a Grow node, or if I refer somebody who buys a Grow node, installs that on my computer or in the cloud, what is that Grow node doing that's making all of this possible? Why is the node so important in this whole story?
I mean, these nodes are the foundation to all of this, right? Without the nodes, we can't accomplish everything we're talking about. Let me back up just a little bit. I go to a lot of regenerative conferences, most of them. I speak at many of them. There is so much excitement out of regenerative agriculture. And I listen to 2 days worth of what people are doing and how that's affecting the climate and how that's affecting our soil health and how we're closing the loop. All awesome pieces. But none of them have the solution to do this at a scale and to build this in with a program that has incentives for the farmers to do this. And understanding the lack of trust that the farmer inevitably has with the government or anybody who wants that data. So The grow node allows us to crack that code in a way that builds that incentive and solve what we need to solve, all these pieces that everybody is so excited to solve, but lacks the fundamental like foundation to do it. That's what the grow nodes are. They decentralize that system and they build that trust to a world that doesn't currently have it, because we shouldn't, because it's been wrecked. So the grow node allows us to trust where our food is coming from and incentivize farmers to do what's right in that process.
Awesome. Great response. So obviously nobody has a crystal ball. We can't make any predictions, but what are your hopes and dreams for the Grow blockchain, for the products that you guys are creating that run on the Grow blockchain? 5-10 years from now, how has Grow helped to accomplish the mission that you've had, sounds like, for most of your life?
These are hard questions for me to answer because my brain just goes with all these pieces that I'm so excited about. But first and foremost, transparency. The end consumer who's disconnected from farms can understand where their food comes from. They can understand with trust how that system works, and they can feel good about that. And then that incentivizes farmers to grow their food sustainably in a regenerative way that closes the loop, that allows us to take care of our environment a little bit better, to care for our soils so that our soils sequester and utilize this carbon that's in excess. We utilize that carbon, we have an environment for our children that's better off. And then going into that, we actually can, with all these data points, we can track the nutrition better too. We can understand we have a more nutrient dense food that's grown more sustainably and better, so that we can localize our food system and eat food, proteins and macros and micros that will allow us to be a healthier people altogether across the board, right? Not just the 1%ers, but everybody. We can make sure the people who don't have food currently can have food, because we have this macro data set which we're tracing it and tracking it and getting it to the right spots.
Love it. I mean, your mission is just so inspiring. I love what you're doing. Thank you for taking this time and kind of sharing with us a peek into your world. Thank you, Austin, for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe.
And to everyone watching at home, that's the end of this series for Grow. We'll be back soon with another series. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.